Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rethinking Iran's book forum event today. My name is Nargis Bajogli. I'm an assistant professor here at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, and welcome to our SAIS Rethinking Iran initiative. Every year, we run a lot of book forum events on new books that have come out. On different topics that we work on here at the initiative. And today's is one that I'm really excited about. It's not a book on Iran, although it touches upon Iran a lot, but it's a book on sanctions. And that's something that we've worked on a ton in the initiative itself. So we're really looking forward to this conversation. I'm really thrilled to be joined by the author of the book that we're discussing, Agathe Demarais. She is the author of Backfire, How Sanctions Reshape the World Against U.S. Interests, which I'm sure we're going to have a really fascinating conversation about throughout this hour. She's the Global Forecasting Director of the Economist Intelligence Unit, and she was previously a senior policy advisor for the French Treasury in Russia and Lebanon, working directly on sanctions and other economic and financial issues. Welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today. I'm delighted to be here.
Of course. So as we were speaking a little bit before we came on air, and I was telling you I loved your book. I really was. There's so many highlights in it as I was going through it. One of the reasons is, first of all, this is an extremely timely book. You know, you're looking at sanctions. In the ways in which sort of the ripple effects of sanctions. So not simply, should sanctions be pursued or not pursued, but you're looking at, okay, here are sanctions on various countries around the world, and what are their ripple effects? And in particular to the interest of the United States, to the interest of American and European businesses, and sort of what are the either intended or unintended consequences of sanctions policies. And one of the reasons I really enjoyed reading it is because, we're implementing more and more sanctions around the world. And it seems to be that we're having not as many critical conversations about what sanctions do and their ripple effects, both within the countries in which they're being targeted, but especially and also, and what I really love about your book is you change the frame and you make us look at the ways in which they have ripple effects on the countries that are implementing the sanctions. So I want to start with what brought you to working on sanctions and to writing this book.
Thanks. I think that's a perfect intro question. And it's been a long process in the making, I would say. So as you said, I'm a former French Treasury official, and I was posted in Moscow and then Lebanon. And I was actually in Moscow in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and started to back separatist rebels in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. And so from one day to another, that was my intro to sanctions, because I joined a task force working on Russia sanctions back in February 2014. So, of course, I was in Moscow liaising with Paris, Brussels, and the US about how to create and implement sanctions against Russia. And already at the time, what was really interesting for me, and it was really my intro to sanctions, is that we would have meetings with some European companies saying, okay, sanctions on Russia, but these sanctions have impacts on our businesses. They were not saying they were against sanctions. They were saying there are impacts on our businesses in Europe. And so it's important that these are taken into account. And so I had this first idea that sanctions, as you said very rightly, have effects beyond their targets all around the world. I actually make the point in the book that I think sanctions have an impact on everyone around the world. So that was my intro to sanctions. And then I moved to the Middle East, to Lebanon. I was posted in Beirut for 3 years, and I was actually covering Iran when the nuclear deal was signed in 2015. And actually, there were two things that really struck me about sanctions when I was posted in Beirut. The first one was a Syrian friend telling me that he couldn't buy a bike for his son's birthday because of sanctions. And I was very skeptical about this. And I tried to explain to him that I didn't think it was due to sanctions against Syria. But it was really interesting to see that Syrians thought that sanctions had this impact. And so I had the idea that it would be really interesting to disentangle what were really ripple effects from sanctions and what were not. And the other thing is that we would have, after the conclusion of the nuclear deal, a lot of discussions with European companies at the French embassy, trying to tell them to go back to Iran, because it was really important for the Iranian economy and to convince Iran to stay in the nuclear deal and that it would be reaping benefits from the nuclear deal. But European companies didn't want to go back to Iran because they were worried that the US would exit the nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions against Iran, which is exactly what happened a few years afterwards. So that was all my introduction to the idea that sanctions have ripple effects. And then I moved to London in 2017. I left the French civil service, something that nobody ever does. And I was actually covering Russia for the Economist Intelligence Unit, where I work today. And the Nord Stream 2 pipeline saga, of course, in hindsight, it wasn't a great idea to build a pipeline connecting Russia to Europe, to ship more Russian gas to Europe. But what was really interesting to me was that this pipeline was creating diplomatic tension. So again, one more ripple effect from sanctions. And so all in all, after a few years, I thought that it would be interesting to take a look at the ripple effects of sanctions. What were really these ripple effects? Because I think that sanctions are a very important tool for US diplomacy today. And I'm focusing on American sanctions in the book because the US is the sanctioning power. But we need to have a clear view about what they can do, what they cannot do, what side effects they have, and then to say, okay, maybe they're the proper tool to do this and that, but maybe they're not the proper tool to do this and that. And so that was what drove me to write this book, and it was published in November 2022, which has been, a timing when there's a lot of interest about sanctions, as we were discussing before the event started.
Yeah, so you write in your book, few, if any, foreign policy tools have as big an impact as sanctions. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, when I read about sanctions by either policymakers or international relations scholars, political scientists, economists, they often talk about sanctions as an alternative to war. And yet one of the things that you're sort of putting forward here is to, instead of us thinking as the US imposes sanctions on X country for whatever reason, whatever behavioral change that they want to see happen, or whatever things that they might be against, whether it's Russian invasion of Ukraine or, Iran's nuclear program or what may be. You're actually part of what you're trying to do in this book is to shed light on the fact that this is actually an extremely powerful an extremely powerful foreign policy tool, and its geopolitical implications are what you say are sort of the biggest that there might be. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yes, of course. So the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that sanctions fill in the void between, on the one hand, empty diplomatic declarations, which are not going to do anything. And I speak here as a former diplomat. When you do a diplomatic declaration, when you condemn something, it means you cannot do or do not want to do anything. And on the other end, you have military interventions. Not great. Not a great option at all. And so sanctions fill in this void. And usually they're seen as a low cost, very quick tactics for American policymakers. And I mean, on paper, it is very true because you only need one night to draft sanctions and then impose them. And actually, in practice, they're not implemented by American policymakers. They are implemented by banks and companies all around the world. They are the ones who need to check that the transactions that they process comply with US sanctions. So it's a form of externalization of US foreign policy in some ways. So very cheap, very quick. I think that these are really on paper great advantages. But as I try to show in the book, and actually especially unilateral US sanctions, they really do have impacts all around the world. And I actually have, and I'm sure that we're going to discuss them, 4 big case studies. I won't say too much about them, but still I'll say a few words. I have a case study about whether sanctions made it more difficult for Iran to tackle the COVID pandemic. So that is to say the humanitarian impact of sanctions. I also have a case study about how sanctions can have ripple effects on diplomatic relations. And here I try to tell the story of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline saga that really had a massive detrimental impact on US-EU relations at a time when it would probably have been better to have collaboration on Russia. I also discuss how sanctions can disrupt commodities markets. This was the case of unilateral US sanctions on Rusal, a Russian aluminium giant, also in 2018, that had ripple effects all around the world, literally, and how sanctions also have an impact on the strategy of European, notably, but also foreign companies in general, non-American companies in general. And here I tell the case of Total, a French energy giant that had to withdraw from Iran after the US pulled out of the nuclear deal. And I think it's very clear when I give these 4 examples that sanctions have impacts all around the world on diplomatic relations, on companies, on the population, on commodities markets. I think that's very clear. And my view is that we need to take these into account. And that's what I try to do in the book.
So what I love about this book, and I know we have a lot of scholars and educators who listen in on these book forums, and one, it's a very, very clear book, like very clearly written. The narrative is very clear. It's fast paced. It gets you, it's not one of these things where you get bogged down in the details in many ways. And so I think this is a really excellent book to use in the classroom. And one of the reasons is also you do an excellent job summarizing some of the key states that have been sanctioned and what's, from Cuba to North Korea to Venezuela to Iran, Russia, definitely. So can we talk about first before, because I really want to get into your case studies quite a bit, but the kind of work that you did looking at these different heavily sanctioned countries, and sort of what you draw out as far as making very clear, and I think you do a really good job of this, is saying, first of all, every sanctions case is different, and also different kinds of sanctions, even on the same country, are differently sort of thought out, and in practice, they sort of work differently. So before we get into your case studies, can we talk about the country cases that you sort of bring out here, and why you picked those and what those are doing for you in the narrative of this book?
Yes, of course. So essentially, I would assume that most people watching us today haven't read the book. So the book has 3 parts. In the first part, I try to give a brief overview of how sanctions became such a central tool for US foreign policy. And I will say much more about that in a second. In the second part, we have the case studies that I've mentioned, so Nord Stream 2, Rusal, Iran. And then in the third part, I'm taking a look at the future of sanctions. And I argue in the book that export controls, as we're seeing from the US on semiconductors against China, for instance, are probably the sanctions of tomorrow. And in between, I also discussed the tools that countries under sanctions are gradually developing to escape sanctions and vaccinate themselves against sanctions. But to go back to the first part, I thought that I needed to start the book with, well, there was a big question that I was trying to answer in the first part. It was, how did sanctions become so important for US foreign policy? Because it wasn't always the case. Absolutely not. I mean, sanctions have actually become such a crucial tool for US policymakers only 2 decades ago, I would argue. And so the first case that I mentioned is Cuba. There's been an embargo, trade embargo against Cuba since 1960. I actually argue in the book that it hasn't been successful. I think that the point of the embargo was clearly regime change in Cuba. Well, 63 years later, it's clear that it hasn't happened. And that the embargo against Cuba still reflects concerns, legacy concerns, actually, from the Cold War. So that was the first case study. And I also discussed North Korea, another trade embargo after the end of the Korean War, very blunt tool that has a lot of side effects on the population of targeted countries. So really not a great option. But actually, modern sanctions are not trade embargoes anymore. Countries that impose sanctions, such as the US, but the EU also, Canada, Australia, don't impose trade embargoes anymore precisely because of these humanitarian side effects. And these were very clear, for instance, in Iraq, where a very high number of children died because of the very blunt trade embargo that was imposed. So what happened is that after 9/11, there was actually the invention of financial sanctions. And these were completely new, and they were invented, I don't want to say randomly, but almost. There was an aha moment within OFAC, the US Treasury agency in charge of drafting and implementing sanctions. At the time, the priority was to track Al-Qaeda and other terror groups shortly after 9/11. And one way to do this was to track financial flows. It's actually still a key way to fight against terror. And what happened is that, a bit randomly, targeters from OFAC, and these are people who draft sanctions, they noticed that North Korea was using a single bank called Banco Delta Asia to do business all around the world. And so you had this single bank connecting North Korea, the bank was based in Macau, with the rest of the world, and that allowed North Korea to do a number of illicit activities, such as drugs trafficking or smuggling of illicit goods or counterfeiting money. Actually, North Korea is very, very skilled at that. And so OFAC had an idea. If they cut the ties between Banco Delta Asia and the rest of the global financial network, well, then it would deal a blow to North Korea. And this is exactly what happened. And this was the invention of financial sanctions. And then sanctions were applied to bigger countries than North Korea. The North Korean economy, just like Cuba, is very small. So it was Iran. And in Iran, the strategy was refined, targeting Iranian banks, which in practice made it impossible for Iran to do trade with its trade partners. And this had mostly an impact on Europe. Europe was on board with these sanctions. This was well before the nuclear deal was signed and well before the US exited the nuclear deal. So Iran, and then Venezuela, and then Russia from 2014. And what was interesting is that, so in Iran, you still had financial sanctions, also a freeze of the reserves of the central bank. But these were, I would say, tools that had been invented against North Korea. They were refined, put to a greater scale, but still the same tools. What happened is that in 2014 against Russia, the US invented a new concept because Russia was such a big economy that it was very difficult to target it. And so the US invented the concept of sectoral sanctions against the energy, financial, and military sectors in Russia. And so overall, in this first part of the book, I try to show how from Cuba in 1960 to Russia 2014 and now 2022, sanctions became such a central tool in US foreign policy, and how the US targeted gradually bigger and bigger economies. Russia is the 9th largest economy in the world. So obviously you don't target Russia the same way that you target Cuba or North Korea. And the ripple effects from targeting a country like Russia or Iran are much bigger all around the world, because these countries have ties that are much more developed with the rest of the global economic landscape.
Yeah, and you make a really big point about that in the book, that the size of the economy of the targeted state is obviously very important. But a troubling trend is that the U.S. is beginning to target bigger and bigger economies, and therefore the ripple effects become larger. And then you also have and you discuss the ways in which countries have become very adept at sanctions busting, and because oftentimes, especially the kinds of countries that you're focusing in on the book here, and the ones that get sort of these big kinds of sanctions packages towards them, comprehensive packages, are countries that are not going to throw their hands up when they're being sanctioned and say, okay, US, our bad, we're going to change our behavior. That's not the nature of these states. And so therefore, they're going to be looking for ways to bust through sanctions. And the busting of sanctions then creates certain realities, some of which means that, goods get in, even though sanctions are not meant to, but others are alliances that are being formed that are trying to push away from sort of US dollar hegemony. And I want us to get to that a little bit later. But I want us to get into your 4 case studies, because I think they're really fascinating. Maybe we can start with, or I'll let you start with wherever you want to, but why did you pick these case studies, and what do you want what are the takeaways from them in your mind that are really important for us to sort of understand as we're thinking through sanctions?
Wow, that's a really big question. I think that to me,
so you take it however you want.
the key takeaway, the key thread between all of these case studies is that the US needs to engage allies to impose sanctions and shouldn't resort to unilateral sanctions. I don't think that they are a great idea. And actually, one of the conclusions of the books is that multilateral sanctions, with the US working with its European allies, notably, but also Asian allies, are probably a better option than unilateral sanctions. And I'll explain why in a second. Essentially, when we take a look at US unilateral sanctions, we have sanctions that were imposed, for instance, following the US exit from the nuclear deal. And actually, let's start, given the Iran focus of this forum, let's start with the case study about Total in Iran and how US sanctions against Iran following the 2018 exit from the US of the nuclear deal really had an impact on European companies. So I think that here, to discuss this one, we need to define what secondary sanctions are. And there's a lot of confusion about what US secondary sanctions are. We hear a lot about them, but actually it's sometimes very hard to know what they are. When the US imposes a secondary sanction program, well, actually when a sanctions program includes a secondary component against a country, as is the case against Iran today, well, then all companies around the world, not only American companies, but all companies around the world must make a choice between, say, Iran and the US markets. And so obviously that's a no-brainer. No company, or 99.9% of companies, will pick the US market and using the US dollar and using American banks if they have to choose. And so what that means is that when the US goes down the secondary sanctions route, it means that all companies around the world have to respect US demands, which means that US sanctions, which in theory shouldn't really have an impact on European companies. You know, European companies don't have an impact on American businesses because Europe doesn't impose secondary sanctions. Well, it means that European companies, all companies around the world, need to have a view about US secondary sanctions for their business decisions. And so one of the case studies that I tell is how Total, French energy giant that had been present in Iran for a number of years, had made big investments in a gas field in Iran following the nuclear deal, hoping that the nuclear deal would hold. But after the US unilateral exit from the deal, when Iran was complying with the terms of the deal, well, the threat of US secondary sanctions meant that Total had to leave the Iranian market pretty much immediately. And that really shows how sanctions have an impact on the strategies of Western businesses. And that really strained also diplomatic relations between the US and the European Union, because European Union countries tried to appeal the US decision. Letters were written by European governments. There was really this view that the US perhaps could give some exceptional authorizations to European businesses that were caught in the crossfire. Because what is really interesting here to keep in mind is that in theory, legally, European businesses only need to respect European law and so could stay in Iran on paper. So they were really caught in the crossfire. They knew that they needed to exit Iran, and the US position was very inflexible. And I try to explain in the book that in my view, it was really damaging to American standing. I think that the US exit from the nuclear deal was damaging to US standing because it showed that the US was not complying with its side of the bargain, but also very damaging for diplomatic relations. Of course, this was the Trump era, so a different era from today, and we've seen much more interest from the Biden administration in European economic interests, but still it really strained relations. And it fueled a perception, which in my view is dangerous, that the US uses sanctions to advance its own economic interests. I'm not sure that this is true, but this is the perception in Europe. And I can understand this perception. And so in my view, this is all dangerous and not great for US diplomacy. And so that's one of the key takeaways that I try to highlight in the book. And we have other case studies, but I'll still let you ask a question so I don't speak endlessly.
Yeah, no. Actually, let me take it out of the book for a second, because it relates to Secretary Yellen just the other day said, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but she said something to the effect that though the US sanctions on Iran have produced a lot of economic damage to the economy of the country, it hasn't produced the changes that they had hoped would happen. And how do you see the admission of that from Secretary Yellen in conversation with what you're bringing up in your book about the backfire, right? The sort of backfire effects or the ripple effects of sanctions. You can't, and I know folks who are right now extremely angry at everything that is going on in Iran are trying to figure out ways to further pressure the government, but it's essentially there isn't much left to sanction on the country. And as you say, individual sanctions are highly symbolic. And so what happens in this instance where a country gets sanctioned so incredibly heavily, there isn't much leverage left. The intended outcomes of the sanctions have not been fruitful from the perspective of the implementer, and it's had all of these backfire ripple effects to European companies. Essentially, how does that join in with the arguments and the sort of what you're putting forward as the premise of your book?
So I would make a distinction between before 2015 and the conclusion of the nuclear deal and after 2015. So I argue in the book that sanctions were probably one of the reasons why Iran agreed to sign a nuclear deal in 2015. And actually, what is really interesting here is that we have a clear illustration of the fact that sanctions tend to work better when they target countries where the population has a say in governance. So of course, Iran is a theocracy, it is a small human rights record. But what happened is the Iranian population elected, by Iranian standards, a reformist, Hassan Rouhani, who had pledged to get sanctions lifted. And so this is exactly what happened. And it shows that there is a link between the population signaling its displeasure with what sanctions do, the negative effects of sanctions on the Iranian economy, and the willingness of a country to change its behavior, and in that case, to sign a nuclear deal. So I would say pre-2015, I'm actually of the view that sanctions had an impact to make it more likely that Iran would sign a nuclear deal. But then we had 2018 and the US exit from the nuclear deal and unilateral sanctions. And actually, I wrote the book, I finished the first draft, then it was updated with the latest events in Ukraine, but I finished the first draft in mid-2021. And my conclusion was already that Iran would not rejoin the nuclear deal. And at the time, it was a bold forecast. So I do forecasting for my day job, but it was really a bold forecast. And in the summer of 2022, we had a lot of noises indicating that a nuclear deal would be inked, a new one, a revival of the Iran nuclear deal. And I was always very skeptical because my reasoning is that if a country believes that it will be under sanctions forever, then its incentives to change its behavior. In the case of Iran, I would actually make another separate case regarding Russia, because sanctions on Russia have other objectives. But in the case of Iran, I think that there is a view from the Iranian leadership that sanctions will remain in place forever. So Iran doesn't have any incentives to change its behavior to comply with a deal that the US could exit after a few years, especially if a Republican president is to be elected in 2024. And so from that perspective, the calculus from the Iranian leadership is probably that it is better off adjusting to sanctions and to actually diversify economic links away from sanctioning countries. So there are no ties with the US pretty much, but it's exactly what you mentioned a few minutes ago. It's about having more links with countries that are also under sanctions. So it's all the emergence of this axis, such as Russia, China, Venezuela, all the rogues, the coalition of the rogues. I wouldn't be so worried if China wasn't in there. But with China, we have really an economic heavyweight that is part of this coalition. And China is really at the forefront of the development of mechanisms to vaccinate countries against sanctions. And I don't say circumvent sanctions, I really say vaccinate, preemptive measures that will gradually diminish the effectiveness of sanctions. And so if we go back to my point about the fact that sanctions fill in the void between empty diplomatic declarations and deadly military interventions, and I think, for instance, in the case of Russia, sanctions are a very important tool today to weigh on Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine. Well, I think that this will be a seismic change for American policymakers to be deprived of the sanctions tool.
And here I want to go to your chapter on sanctions busting, because I think actually what you just said is a great segue into that. You highlight throughout the book different ways that states attempt to bust through sanctions, and you say some of them, whatever, like it's illegal, but that's not what American policymakers are staying awake at night about. And you write, I'm going to quote you, their fears lie elsewhere. Over the past few years, Washington's enthusiasm for sanctions has fueled the development of state-backed mechanisms aimed at circumventing America's coercive measures. U.S. allies and foes alike are openly taking steps to evade American sanctions, which they often believe are an abuse of power. These sanctions busting mechanisms vary, but they have one thing in common. They all seek to build alternative financial channels that bypass the US dollar. And obviously, I mean, well, it seems that this has even been heightened since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the imposition of sanctions on Russia. There seems to be much more activity by bigger economies like Russia and China going towards what you're calling vaccination, especially that right, I mean, in some ways, Russia had vaccinated itself to a certain extent after the 2014 sanctions, but still much of the foreign reserves that it had out abroad that got frozen, that became a lesson for or a warning signal for a lot of other countries, especially those with bigger economies, that if something happens that Washington is not a fan of, their foreign reserves abroad could also be sort of targeted in this way. So how take us into this world of sanctions busting and this particular, when state-backed enterprises start to come together to sort of create alternatives?
Yeah, and I think that here the Iranian example is very, very important to keep in mind. So taking one step back, it is important to understand sanctions busting, to understand how sanctions work. They are called financial sanctions for a good reason. It's because they target financial flows and financial channels. And as I was saying at the start of the event, it is up to banks and companies, but especially banks, financial institutions, to check that all of the transactions that they process comply with sanctions. So it's really about financial ties. Say you go to the bank and the bank checks that the transaction is okay or not. So it's really about financial ties. And so unsurprisingly, a number of countries that are under sanctions or that fear that they could fall under sanctions or that want to build their own financial channels so that they don't use Western financial channels for prestige reasons, for instance. That's the case in many BRICS countries. A number of countries are developing alternative financial tools that do not rely on the US dollar or the euro or Western financial channels in general. And so I argue in the book that there are three main developments. The first one is de-dollarization, and actually you've hinted at it. De-dollarization, that's very clear. It's about not using the US dollar, and it's a first step to vaccinate an economy against US sanctions. And so we're seeing this actually happening, for instance, in Russia. There's a lot of discussions about the central bank of Russia's reserves being frozen. Only half of them were frozen because half were denominated in Western currencies, such as the US dollar or the euro, but the other half was denominated in non-Western currencies, such as the Chinese renminbi or in gold. And so that means that even if after even after this freeze, Russia still had access to around 300 billion US dollars of reserves that couldn't be frozen. So that's still significant. And this is not a random thing. Russia had been hard at work since 2014 trying to de-dollarize its economy. Staying on the Russia case on de-dollarization, we're seeing this happen also for trade flows. And since 2021, the majority of China-Russia bilateral trade is denominated either in Russian rubles or in Chinese renminbi. Again, that's not random. That's all about taking preemptive measures against potential sanctions. And this is a choice that actually was made at the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in early 2021, with countries such as China, India, Pakistan, Russia, saying they want to develop payments in local currencies. It's all about dodging sanctions. So de-dollarization is a first trend. But if you don't use the US dollar, but you continue to use financial systems and channels that are Western ones, well, you're really not protected against sanctions. And here, what is really interesting is what happened in 2012 when SWIFT cut the access of Iranian banks to its network under US pressure. And I would say this was a wake-up call for a number of countries that fear they could fall under US sanctions or that are under US sanctions, Russia and China mainly, but also Venezuela, because they decided that they needed to develop alternatives to SWIFT. They don't need to rely on SWIFT. SWIFT at the moment is in a completely hegemonic position. It processes most financial transfers around the world, but why wouldn't there be a Chinese alternative? And this is exactly what China is hard at work building. It's called CIPS. It is much smaller than SWIFT, about 100 times smaller in terms of the amount of transactions that are processed. But China doesn't really care. What it wants is to have a plan B, a backup, in case it were to be cut off from SWIFT. That's the defensive take. But there is also an offensive take, because one could imagine that when China is the world's largest economy, which looks likely by 2040, or even before that, China is already the second largest economy in the world, China could say, well, if you want to do business with us, you need to use our system, our CIPS. And so that would mean that China could cut off entire countries or companies from the Chinese market of 1.4 billion people. And China is the manufacturing power of the world. So very, very significant trend here. And the third tool is central bank digital currencies. And again, China leads the way. More than 300 million Chinese people, I actually think that this figure is probably closer to 400 million Chinese people now, already use e-yuan, electronic yuan, Chinese renminbi in a digital form. It's not a cryptocurrency. It is issued by the central bank of China. It is stored on the wallets of mobile phones of people, just like we store a number of things on our mobile phones. But it uses completely sanctions-proof, 100% Chinese digital tools. And so it's completely immune to sanctions. And of course, there are other advantages to this for China, because it makes it possible for Chinese leadership to track the every moves of people using this digital currency. So there are surveillance capabilities. So all in all, if we take a look at everything, de-dollarization plus some alternative financial channels such as CIPS, but Russia is also building its alternative financial channel, plus digital currencies issued by central banks, it means that bypassing completely Western financial channels, and so Western oversight, will be possible in the future for countries that want to escape sanctions. And so it's really about vaccination. It's really about preemptive measures, not about sanctions circumvention, but really about making themselves immune from sanctions, which, in my view, is going, when we take everything together, to decrease the effectiveness of sanctions going forward. So that is, from my perspective, going to be a very important change, seismic change for American policymakers, because at the moment, when there is a crisis, American policymakers tend to turn to sanctions immediately. But if sanctions do not work anymore, I do not know what tool American policymakers will have to advance US interests all around the world and to confront countries such as Russia and the aggression of Ukraine.
Right. But the picture that you're laying out is not just one in which sanctions become harder, but also one in which, or I guess I would pose it as a question for you. I mean, what I'm hearing from you is not just an argument about sanctions becoming less and less effective as these systems and processes take fold, and sort of there's more energy behind some of them as time goes on, but also it will have huge ripple effects on the U.S. economy, right? And the position of the U.S. economy in the world market, especially with China on the rise, and the potential for it becoming the number one economy in a little bit over a decade.
Mm-hmm. So I think that sanctions by themselves do not threaten the hegemony of the US dollar. It's not only sanctions. In my view, we have to take a step back. It's about the fragmentation of the geopolitical and economic and financial landscape. It's all about fragmentation. We're seeing the emergence more and more of a number of countries challenging the post-Second World War Western-led order that was mainly US-led. We're seeing the emergence of blocs. So we have a pretty cohesive, well-defined Western bloc. The US, the EU, I would add countries such as Japan or Australia to this Western bloc. We have a bloc led by China and Russia, and they have their own financial channels. And we have a third bloc that actually is going to be very important in the future. It is countries that have not yet picked a side, mostly emerging countries. And they will be really the battle of tomorrow for both blocs, the Western one and the China-led one, for influence, for economic footprint, for the use of financial channels. Will emerging countries use Western financial channels or Chinese financial channels? That's really an open question that I think will be really, really important. But it's all about this fragmentation trend, which I think is going to be very significant. And so currency developments will probably mirror this trend. So there will be the US dollar being used in, well, the Western bloc, maybe the Chinese renminbi after maybe Chinese capital controls are lifted in the other China-led bloc. And the third bloc, well, it's not really clear. There's also the question of the euro, actually, because the euro is used just as much as the US dollar for global trade. For global trade, the US dollar has a share of 40%. For trade, the euro has the same market share. So there's also the question here, but to me, we're going towards this fragmentation, and we're seeing this trend actually happen also in the reserves of central banks around the world. We're seeing a number of central banks diversify their reserves away from the traditional US dollar, trying to have a diverse mix. And so I would say that sanctions and the overuse of sanctions accelerates this trend. It's not at the root of this trend, but it certainly accelerates it, because in addition to wanting to have their own financial channels, countries also want to circumvent or vaccinate themselves against sanctions. So I would say that it turbocharges this phenomenon.
And in the third section of your book, you really sort of you take on this question of decoupling from China, and you argue that it would backfire if that's the road that's taken. You tackle questions of export control as sort of being the new potential sort of way that sanctions go. And you look at the financial you look at the high tech sector, and especially questions of microchips and the current battle between the US and China around that issue. And I think that this is where you're really like trying to get your reader to start focusing in on attention about where sanctions are and how we need to think about these kinds of sanctions moving forward. I would love for you to unpack that area for us, because I loved reading that section of your book.
Thank you so much. You're too kind. You so many compliments about my book, even before you even started. Thank you. So actually, I have to make a confession. I wasn't planning to write about export controls when I first tried to write the book, but I was working on the book in 2020, 2021, and I think that it became clear to me while I was doing the research for the book that something was happening in the area of export controls. Export controls are not new. So unlike financial sanctions, they're not new. They were used a lot during the Cold War by the US to prevent the former Soviet Union from getting access to dual use technology, that is to say, technology that could be used for civilian and military purposes. But I could sense that something was happening and it was happening in the tech field. And actually, it became very clear to me as I researched the book that, from my perspective, export controls are the sanctions of tomorrow for two reasons. The first reason is my assumption that financial sanctions will gradually become less effective in the future. We've just discussed all of this. So if we agree with this assumption, and of course it's open to debate, but that's my assumption. And the second assumption is that economies are being digitalized. Technology is becoming increasingly important. We're talking over Zoom. And there are actually very tiny electronic components that are enabling this, and they're called semiconductors. And they will be, from my perspective, the crux of the battle for economic dominance in the coming decades. I'm not even talking today or tomorrow. I'm really trying to have a long-term view in my book up to 2050 or 2060. And why is that? Well, because semiconductors have civilian applications, but also military applications. They're found in missiles and submarines and fighter jets everywhere. And so the US has this view that the country that will control the best semiconductor technology will have a military advantage. And the US is obviously worried about the Taiwan question at the moment. And so we're seeing this realization in the US, I would say, that the US has an ace up its sleeve here, because American companies control the technology to build the most advanced, that is to say, the smallest, semiconductors. They're all from American companies, the technology. Then the chips are built mostly in Taiwan and South Korea and a bit in China, but the technology is American. And so what the US wants to do is to ensure that the gap between the most advanced American semiconductors and the most advanced Chinese semiconductors remains intact, which will mean that the US retains its lead in the sector. And so that's what the US is trying to do with export controls on semiconductor technology against China. That's actually, events have really proved what I researched in the book and what I wrote in the book right, because this is exactly what we're seeing happening at the moment. But I actually have reservations about this strategy. It's a bit like sanctions, actually. I'm not saying export controls will not work. I'm not saying they're not the right tool. What I think is that we need to have a clear idea about the way China is going to respond to them and the ripple effects of these measures. And then maybe we can say they're the right way to go, or we can say, okay, all things considered, maybe not. And for me, there are two big question marks. The first question mark is how China will respond to this. I don't think that we can expect China to sit tight and wait to see its access to semiconductors being curbed. I don't see this happening. And actually, when I took a look at financing from the Chinese government in the semiconductor sector, Chinese R&D expenses are 7 times higher than American R&D expenses in the field. And China has the objective that by 2049, so a long way from here, it will have the best semiconductors. So I think that there is this big push from China. Of course, it won't work immediately. There will be a lot of problems to build an indigenous supply chain for semiconductor, but I'm pretty sure that China will get there eventually, and that will have massive consequences on the global economic and geopolitical scene. And the other question is about Europe, because the US is putting a lot of pressure on European governments and companies to follow suit with export controls. But actually, it's really interesting what's happening. It's that a number of European governments and companies are seeing this as a remake of secondary sanctions disputes, because they're saying, well, we're not too keen. China is a big trade partner for us, so we're not entirely sure that we want to go down that road. So there is this question mark: what will the European Union do? And I think that we go back to my view about the fact that sanctions may be the answer sometimes, but we need to have a clear view about how the targets will react, about how allies will react, about the ripple effects. And then we can say whether they are the appropriate tool, and they sometimes are, for instance, as is the case against Russia at the moment, or not. And I think that's what I try to do in the book.
Who is your main audience for this book? Like, who is your ideal audience for reading this book?
Everyone.
Why?
No, actually, I would love for a book to be read by people who have very little knowledge about sanctions and international relations and geopolitics. And that's how I try to write the book. I try to make it as clear and accessible as possible. I try to make the case studies engaging, like writing a novel a little bit. That is really what I try to do. And it goes back to my view that sanctions have an impact on everyone around the world. So I try to make the book as accessible as possible, because there's been a few books published on sanctions recently, such as Nicholas Mulder's The Economic Weapon, that are for the general public, but actually not that many. And to me, this is a paradox, because sanctions have such a big impact on geopolitics and people and economies around the world. But at the same time, well, the general public doesn't have access to a lot of books about sanctions. Of course, there's scholarly literature, but in terms of books for general public, not too many. So that's how I try to write the book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I am complimenting your book so much is because I think you've pulled that off. You have written this without jargon and in an engaging way. And one of the reasons I'm so appreciative of it is that you've given us a language. And I think sanctions, and in some ways, as someone who's been studying them for a while, and as someone who pays a lot of attention to language that people use, I think sanctions are confusing on purpose. Right. Just like in many ways, like when we think about certain conflicts around the world, and some people are like, oh, that's a really difficult conflict to understand. Well, it's a difficult conflict to understand, I think, oftentimes on purpose, because when you communicate things to people and they can understand them, then they can have ideas about it, and they can have opinions about it, and they can have critiques about it, or they can ask questions. And when we can't ask questions, it means that certain policies just continue onwards. And what you've given us is a book that allows us to understand the complexity that sanctions are, but in a way that that then allows us to see what's happening, and that gives us a language to understand it. And one of the reasons I asked you for who your audience is that you end the book, your very last pages of the book, you end it by saying that Washington's lack of interest in the side effects of its unilateral policies also united both friends and enemies against U.S. sanctions. For American policymakers, the loss of the previously all-powerful sanctions weapon will be a systemic change. Part of what I read into this is that, part of your audience are U.S. policymakers, who includes that everyone category that you delineated. But to me, it's, in addition to giving us a language and a way and a framework of understanding how sanctions have developed in the post-World War II and more contemporary, actually, like I love Nicholas Mulder's book, and it's a great history. And what you're doing is you're bringing us into the present, and you are sort of giving us this geopolitical analysis of what is happening here. But you really do, I think, a lot of times, and you do it with care. I've noticed that you're not doing it with sort of wanting to come out of the fence, like really critiquing. You're doing it out of a place of care, of saying, hey, my fellow diplomats and policymakers on the other side of the ocean, like maybe we need to be thinking about the ripple effects of these things. And you do it, I think, in a language and in a way that folks would be receptive to. They don't feel like they're necessarily being critiqued from the get-go. But it really does paint this, at least from my perspective, this very clear picture of, if we do not question some of the main policies that we are using on an international scale, it's as if we wake up one day and all of these things have happened, and it's like it's whiplash, but it actually shouldn't be whiplash, because there are so many signs along the way, and we're just forging forward as if we're not seeing those signs.
God, there's so much I want to say. And I see that we only have a few minutes left. So the first thing I would say is I've tried actually to bring a European perspective to the American sanctions debate. I've had a lot of conversation with American policymakers, And I think that when I've said how things are perceived sometimes in European countries, I'm not entirely sure that this was always acknowledged or understood in the US. And so that's what I've tried to do, to say, hi, here's a European perspective, former French Treasury official. I've worked on sanctions, don't have anything against them. I haven't become schizophrenic. But here is how we view US sanctions. Then, well, think whatever you think, but this is our take from Europe. So that's something that I've tried to do, and being non-judgmental, just saying this is what's happening, and then maybe they're the right answer, maybe not. That's not my call. So that's something that I've tried to do. The other thing that I would say is there is a lack of knowledge about sanctions that to me is very worrying, because I'm seeing a lot of Russian disinformation campaigns in the global south, fueling resentment against sanctions, saying, for instance, that sanctions are fueling food insecurity or energy insecurity, when in that case, this is not the case, absolutely not the case. What is fueling energy insecurity and energy prices is the invasion of Ukraine, so it's Russia's actions. And what is fueling food insecurity is the Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports, so again, Russia's actions. But because there is a lack of knowledge about such an important tool, it is very easy for this disinformation narrative to gain traction. And to me, this is very worrying. And so this is something else that I try to do in the book, also to try to shed some light about how sanctions work, what they do not do. So that's something that I try to do also. And what else did I want to say? There was something really great that you mentioned, and I've forgotten my train of thought. But anyway, yeah, that's that. Yeah, I really liked everything that you just said.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're unfortunately running out of time, but we could keep talking about this for a really long time. But I just want to, again, really plug this book, Backfire: How Sanctions Reshape the World Against U.S. Interest. It's one of those books that in a few afternoons you could read through, because it's written in such a gripping way and without the jargon, which is so refreshing. And I think it's, like, as you're saying, it is the biggest foreign policy tool right now that the United States is using. And we are doing ourselves a disservice by not reading about it. I just saw you go, please.
Yes, I remember what I wanted to say.
Yeah,
and also sanctions are usually imposed in a rush. There is a crisis unfolding, you push the sanctions button, a few civil servants in a treasury office at OFAC at night will draft sanctions and then implement them. But I think that sometimes this means that the ripple effects won't be acknowledged just because you're in a rush. It's an emergency measure. And so in my view, we sometimes need to take a step back. And I'm seeing that the US Treasury is doing this. Actually, I think it was in November or October. The US Treasury posted a job advert looking for a chief economist who would take a look at the economic effects of US sanctions. So I thought that this was a very positive step. If we can see more of this. But yeah, sometimes they're imposed in a rush, which doesn't make thorough analysis very easy, because then they're implemented. And if the US doesn't see any change in the behavior of the targets, well, there's not really any reason to lift them. So it makes things very difficult. But I think this is also an important consideration to have.
And one of the things we didn't get to, unfortunately, but is this notion, and as you were saying before, definitely on the Iranian side, but also other sanctioned countries, is this notion that there is no off-ramp to US sanctions. And so that therefore there is no incentive from sanctioned countries to be complying in any way, or to be changing things in any way to get off. And so this is also, it's a policy that seems to further entrench conflict actually over time. Anyway, but thank you so much for giving us so much to think about. And Backfire is an excellent book, and I hope everyone who's listening buys it and reads it. We need to understand this tool much better than we do at the moment. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Of course, it was a pleasure. Bye, everyone.